A single word just told you everything you need to know about where this war is actually headed. Trust, or more precisely, the complete absence of it. A senior Iranian official, one of the men shaping how Tehran approaches every conversation with Washington right now, told CNN directly that Iran does not believe President Trump is being truthful in the very talks meant to turn a fragile ceasefire into something lasting. Not a diplomatic sidestep, not careful, hedged language designed to keep both sides at the table. A blunt public declaration that the foundation these negotiations are supposed to rest on may not exist at all. Here is exactly what was said. Ebrahim Azizi, who heads Iran's Parliamentary, National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, told CNN that Tehran has, in his words, no problem continuing peace talks with the United States in principle, but only if Washington proves it is negotiating honestly. He went further, stating plainly that Iran does not believe Trump is telling the truth in these negotiations. And then came the line that should worry anyone hoping this war ends at a negotiating table, rather than on a battlefield. Azizi said Iran considers negotiation itself to be part of the battle, a continuation of the fighting, rather than an alternative to it. Read that carefully. This is not a negotiator describing talks as a path toward peace. This is a negotiator describing talks as another front in an ongoing war. To understand how serious this statement actually is, you need to understand what it is describing the collapse of. Back in mid-June, Washington and Tehran signed a 14-point memorandum of understanding, a genuine, documented framework meant to freeze Iran's nuclear program, reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and open a 60-day window for a permanent settlement. That framework has been unraveling for weeks now, hit by tanker strikes near Oman, retaliatory American bombing runs, Iranian missile attacks on Gulf bases, and finally Trump's own public declaration that the ceasefire itself was finished. Azizi's statement is not describing some abstract, ongoing tension. It is describing the specific, practical collapse of trust, underpinning the one diplomatic framework that was supposed to end this war. Now, picture what this actually looks like from inside the negotiating rooms themselves, wherever they still exist. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has separately confirmed that message exchanges with Washington continue, including direct communication through U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff, but has insisted these exchanges do not amount to actual negotiations. No response has been given to American proposals, according to Araghchi, and Iran sees no basis for formal negotiations to resume under current conditions. This is diplomacy reduced to its barest skeleton, messages passing back and forth through intermediaries, without either side willing to call what is happening an actual negotiation. It is the appearance of a diplomatic process, without the substance most people would recognize as one. This is exactly the trap sitting underneath this entire moment, because Azizi's own words reveal Iran is not refusing talks outright. He explicitly said Tehran has no problem negotiating in principle. The barrier is trust, specifically Iran's belief that Washington is not negotiating in good faith, that promises around unfreezing Iranian assets and building a workable framework have gone unfulfilled. If these same behaviors continue, Azizi warned, then no, meaning no continued engagement. Iran has essentially placed the burden of proof entirely on Washington, demanding evidence of good faith before it will treat these talks as anything more than a continuation of the war by other means. Let's widen the lens, because this is not the first time Iranian officials have made almost exactly the same declaration. And understanding that pattern tells you something important about how deep this mistrust actually runs. Go back to earlier rounds of this conflict. In late June, before the current round of escalation, Foreign Minister Araghchi told NBC News in Geneva that Iran was uncertain whether it could trust the United States. After Israel launched airstrikes just days before a scheduled round of negotiations, strikes the United States insisted it was not involved in planning. Araghchi suggested at the time that Washington may have used talks as cover for the Israeli operation, saying bluntly that Iran did not know how it could trust the United States anymore, calling what happened a betrayal of diplomacy itself. That statement came months before Azizi's current declaration. The specific grievance changes with each round of escalation, but the underlying accusation stays exactly the same. Washington talks peace while enabling war. Now go back even further to comments from an advisor to Iran's own supreme leader, who told Al Jazeera that after the war imposed on Tehran, the Islamic Republic no longer has any trust in the United States at all, a statement made in direct response to earlier Israeli strikes on Iranian territory. And further back still, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman told Press TV that Iran cannot trust the United States following strikes on what Tehran describes as its peaceful nuclear facilities, accusing Washington of colluding with Israel to sabotage diplomatic efforts already underway at the time. This is not a new grievance. This is a recurring, almost ritualized declaration, repeated by different Iranian officials at different moments throughout this entire conflict, each time triggered by a fresh military escalation that Iran says happened while diplomacy was supposedly still in progress. Bring in an even earlier precedent. because this pattern stretches back years before this current war even began. During the original nuclear negotiations that produced the 2015 deal, Iran's own lead negotiator at the time, Abbas Araghchi, the very same official now serving as foreign minister, told state television directly that the basis of those talks was mistrust, and that this was simply the reality both sides had to work within. Even when Iran and world powers eventually did reach an agreement that year, it was built explicitly on the assumption that neither side trusted the other, with snapback provisions designed specifically because both parties expected the deal might eventually collapse. Trust has never been the starting point for Iran-US diplomacy. The absence of trust has always been the starting point. What makes Azizi's current statement different is the context surrounding it. A live, ongoing war rather than a peacetime negotiation, and a ceasefire that Trump himself has already publicly declared dead. Now consider what this means for the actual diplomatic mechanics still technically functioning right now. Reports suggest another round of talks may still be arranged, possibly in Switzerland, even as Iranian officials publicly declare there is no trust and no real basis for negotiation. This contradiction is not new to this conflict. Iranian officials have repeatedly described refusing to negotiate with specific American figures, reportedly rejecting engagement with envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, both of whom led earlier nuclear talks before the war's opening strikes, while remaining open in principle to talks through other channels or with different American representatives. Iran's objection, in other words, is not always to negotiation itself, but frequently to the specific people and specific conditions surrounding it, a distinction that leaves room for talks to continue even amid public declarations that trust is broken down entirely. There's also a structural reason why this particular declaration of mistrust matters more than earlier versions of the same complaint, because of who is actually saying it. Azizi does not speak as a foreign ministry spokesman offering routine rhetorical pushback, nor as an outside commentator. He chairs the Parliamentary committee specifically responsible for national security and foreign policy, a position that gives his public statements real weight inside Iran's own domestic political debate over how to handle relations with Washington. When a figure in that role tells international media that negotiation is simply a continuation of the battlefield, it is not an offhand remark. It is a signal to Iran's own parliament and to the broader political establishment watching closely about how the country's legislative leadership currently views the entire diplomatic track. Consider also how this statement lands relative to the timeline of broken commitments Azizi specifically referenced. The June memorandum was built around a mutual exchange, Iran freezing its nuclear program in return for eased sanctions pressure and unfrozen assets. Weeks into that agreement, according to Azizi's own account, the asset unfreezing Iran expected has not materialized in any meaningful way. This is precisely the kind of concrete, measurable failure that hardens skepticism far more effectively than any abstract political grievance could. It is one thing to distrust an adversary's intentions in the abstract. It is another to point to a specific, documented commitment that has gone unfulfilled weeks after it was supposed to take effect. Now think about how this pattern of repeated, near-identical mistrust declarations, stretching back not just months, but years across multiple rounds of Iran-US diplomacy, shapes how seriously outside observers should treat any future breakthrough announcement. Every time these two countries have approached a genuine diplomatic opening in 2015 and earlier rounds of this current war, and now, again in the aftermath of the June memorandum, a senior Iranian official has eventually stepped forward to declare that trust does not exist and that negotiations cannot be treated as separate from the underlying conflict. Recognizing this as a recurring pattern rather than a uniquely alarming new development is important context, even as it does nothing to reduce how seriously the current moment should be taken given the live, ongoing military escalation surrounding it. Let's bring in what this specific mistrust actually costs in concrete terms, because Azizi was explicit about what Iran believes Washington has failed to deliver. Frozen Iranian assets remain frozen, according to his account, despite what Tehran views as commitments made under the ceasefire framework. No workable framework for a lasting settlement has materialized, even as fighting has continued to flare and subside in cycles for months. Every one of these unmet expectations reinforces the exact narrative Iran's hardline factions have been making since this war began, that engagement with Washington produces promises without delivery, while military pressure keeps escalating regardless of whatever diplomatic track is technically still open. Now bring Iran's own fractured wartime leadership into this picture, because Azizi's statement does not exist in isolation from the broader political pressures shaping Tehran's negotiating posture right now. Iran's new supreme leader, installed under intense wartime pressure just weeks ago, reportedly selected specifically because he was expected to project defiance rather than compromise. presides over a government that cannot easily be seen making concessions to Washington without risking exactly the kind of internal backlash from hardline factions that shaped his own rushed succession in the first place. A Parliamentary Security Committee chairman publicly declaring that negotiation is simply a continuation of the battlefield fits neatly into that political reality, reassuring domestic hardliners that any ongoing engagement with Washington represents strength and strategy, not capitulation. This is where the deeper danger of this specific moment comes into focus. If both sides genuinely believe negotiation is simply an extension of the war rather than an alternative to it, the entire diplomatic framework built around this ceasefire becomes something closer to theater, a process maintained for the appearance of restraint while both governments continue preparing for, and in some cases actively conducting, further military escalation regardless. Azizi's own words make this explicit. Negotiation, in his framing, is not separate from the fighting. It is part of it. Consider what happens next for each of the parties now shaping this fragile, contradictory process. For the United States, the challenge is proving good faith to a negotiating partner that has, by its own repeated public statements across multiple officials and multiple points throughout this war, essentially decided in advance that American sincerity should be doubted until proven otherwise. For Iran's own government, the challenge is domestic, maintaining enough hardline credibility to satisfy factions who view any serious engagement with Washington as weakness, while still leaving enough room for actual diplomacy to eventually produce something that ends a war that has devastated the country's economy and killed its own supreme leader. For any actual negotiators still meeting quietly, whether in Switzerland or through other backchannels, the challenge is finding any meaningful progress possible when the public position of senior officials on both sides increasingly treats the entire process as a formality rather than a genuine path toward resolution. There is also the question of how this declared mistrust interacts with every other flashpoint currently shaping this war simultaneously. Trump has publicly confirmed standing military orders tied to potential threats against his own life. Israel's defense minister has declared readiness to re-engage at any time. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has threatened to expand retaliation to additional American bases if strikes continue. Every one of these separate escalating threats becomes harder to walk back through negotiation if the negotiators themselves, on both sides, are simultaneously telling their own publics that the talks meant to prevent further escalation are not built on trust at all. Now think about what genuine trust building would actually require at this stage of the conflict, given everything Azizi specifically cited as missing: concrete, verifiable action on unfreezing Iranian assets, a workable framework addressing Iran's core demands rather than simply extending temporary pauses in fighting, some demonstrable change in what Iranian officials describe as a pattern of military escalation running alongside diplomatic engagement rather than in place of it. None of these are simple asks, particularly in the middle of an active war where both governments face enormous domestic political pressure to appear strong rather than conciliatory. Whether either side is actually capable of delivering what the other would consider genuine proof of good faith in the middle of ongoing strikes and counterstrikes remains deeply uncertain. Watch also how this specific declaration lands in Washington's own domestic political debate, because it hands ammunition to voices on both sides of the ongoing argument over America's role in this war. Lawmakers skeptical of continued diplomacy can point directly to Azizi's own words as proof that Iran was never seriously engaging in good faith, using the negotiations primarily as cover to regroup militarily. Lawmakers pushing for renewed diplomatic effort can point to the same statement as evidence that Washington's own credibility problem, unfulfilled promises around frozen assets chief among them, is actively undermining whatever chance a lasting settlement might otherwise have. Both sides will read the exact same quote and draw entirely opposite conclusions about what America should do next, a dynamic that has shaped nearly every phase of the domestic debate over this war since it began. Financial markets, too, are likely to treat this kind of statement as one more signal feeding into an already volatile picture. Energy traders, watching this conflict, have learned throughout months of escalation and de-escalation to treat senior officials' public statements about trust and negotiation almost as closely as they track actual military strikes, since collapsing diplomatic credibility often precedes renewed military action by only days or weeks. A senior Iranian parliamentary official publicly declaring negotiations to be an extension of the battlefield is precisely the kind of statement that keeps risk premiums elevated across Gulf shipping and energy markets, regardless of whether any new strikes actually follow in the immediate aftermath. Let's go back to where we started. A single word, trust, and its complete absence, according to one of Iran's own senior officials, from the entire foundation these peace talks are supposed to rest on. Azizi did not close the door entirely. He left it open, conditionally, demanding proof of American good faith before Iran treats these negotiations as anything more than a continuation of the battlefield by other means. Whether that door stays open long enough for genuine diplomacy to actually take hold, or whether this becomes one more chapter in a now years-long pattern of Iranian officials declaring again and again that trust with Washington simply does not exist, may determine whether this war finds its way toward a lasting resolution or toward exactly the kind of prolonged, cyclical conflict that has defined the relationship between these two countries for decades. Thank you for watching. Please like this video and comment your thoughts below so this analysis reaches more people who need to understand exactly how fragile these peace talks really are right now.